Chairman. Welcome, Congressman Steele. Thank you for coming in. You've been consistent, almost as consistent as the tribes in coming up to testify in this committee. I appreciate your conversation related to the study. I think you mentioned the last study that was done was over 12 years ago.
2009.
And do we not have a statutory requirement to do a study every 10 years?
We do indeed, but it has not been honored to this point, and that's why this bill is probably particularly timely in order to spark what should be being done anyway.
And I think in your testimony and others that I've read is it's imperative to have this study because we have a whole new generation of gamblers. Unlike the traditional table games in which you go to the casinos and you bet on the tables, what we're looking at in the array of bills that are being proposed are a brand new wave and a generation of gambling accessibility and opportunities through what we have in our restaurants, through Keno, but the idea of internet and online gambling and the proliferation into sports gambling, it brings a whole different context in regards to the impact, but also the psychological attraction to further addiction. Can you elaborate a little bit more based upon your expertise and experience in this, having written a book on this, anecdotally with a historical connection, talking about this country and this state's connection to the tribes and gambling. Could you offer some insight and your expertise in regards to this new wave of gambling access and how it could impact the potential exponential growth, if not explosion, of potential gambling addiction?
Well, let me respond by just briefly talking about the potential of internet gambling and kids and sports betting. Internet gambling, I mean, very, very clearly would put a casino in just about everybody's pocket. It would put a casino on every phone and every computer and would sharply increase gambling and gambling addiction in this state and wherever it is legalized. Research, I think you'd be interested in this. The latest research now shows that online adult gamblers have dramatically higher problem gambling rates than other adult gamblers. And when you start talking about kids, I would think everybody would be especially concerned. Commercial sports betting now is radically changing the way kids view and consume sports, because see the advertisements constantly. Internet gambling addiction is the fastest growing addiction among American kids, high schoolers, and college students because of real-time sports betting on cell phones and video games. In the United Kingdom, in the UK, 450,000 children now aged 11 to 16 bet regularly, more than those who have taken drugs, smoked, or drunk alcohol. And that's just a tip of the iceberg in order to answer your question.
Thank you. And we talk so much about this building, about revenue. I think in your past testimonies, as I recollect and in reading your book, we very rarely talk about the societal impact. Having been a former congressman in Eastern Connecticut and having been involved in policy making since the origination of the Tribal Compact, could you offer some insight in regards to the landscape? And there's no doubt in this building we have repeated often the incredible contributions of the two tribes through their contributions financially to our state, as well as social well-being. But could you shed some light for your experience in a policy role, the other consequences of increased gambling expansion in the state from your perspective as a former congressman, a former candidate for governor, and an individual that continues to live on Eastern Connecticut on the potential societal impact and what is wrought in regards to communities and lives?
Well, I think that's an important point because we've heard repeatedly now about the $9 billion that have come from our two casinos, and that is a fact. But no one so far has raised the question of what are the economic and social costs. We always talk about the jobs, we always talk about the revenue to the state of Connecticut. What about the economic and social costs? There is an increasing amount, as I said in my testimony, of independent scholarly research that shows that those costs are far greater than the benefits. And that, of course, is becoming an even bigger and bigger problem because the actual revenue has slowed and slowed and slowed, and the more it slows, of course, the greater the costs versus the revenue are. You know, I just would mention that we've heard many, many studies, all commissioned by the casinos, about the money that is being raised, the jobs that would be created. Never, and it just doesn't seem to dawn on anyone that never in any of those studies did they talk about the social and economic costs. Why? This study would help illuminate that. And I would think, I mean, as a former legislator, I know that I would insist on having that kind of information in front of me before I cast a vote on whether or not we were going to massively expand gambling, legalized gambling in this state.
One of the challenges we have is as with many other revenue considerations we have in the state is, Congressman Steele, everybody else is doing it. We're leaving money on the table. What would you say to that the fact that we are surrounded all around us and the opportunities are being lost to gain additional revenue? You must have heard that. What would you say to that from a standpoint of why we shouldn't do it?
I have, yes, indeed, I have heard that. Connecticut had a monopoly on casino gambling, practical monopoly for years and years and years and years. Other states finally decided that they couldn't let that continue. The fact of the matter is that if we massively expand gambling in Connecticut, there will be a massive amount of more gambling in the state, and there will be more costs. Will we lose some revenue? Yeah, we'll lose some revenue. There's no question about it. But that revenue will be more than made up by the amount of money that is being saved on social and economic costs.
The last thing, if I may, is one of the exchanges I had with Mr. Butler, who has been incredibly resourceful and available and been a great partner to the state. One of the interesting parts that we raised about sports gambling was in Rhode Island, their initial foray was to engage in bets on site. But what Rhode Island quickly discovered and changed is that sports gambling goes in hand with internet gambling. And that is the biggest revenue generation. I think in my past exchanges with you, you talked about the incredible technology proliferation and the impact on our youthful users, not only from a standpoint of sports gambling, but could you shed some light in regards to what internet gambling opens up and portends in a future that we could never, ever imagine? I think one of the analogies used was the fact that for a younger generation with a mobile device in their hand, the easy conversion of Candy Rock or Angry Birds could be quickly translated into dollar denominations for internet gambling. What are the real psychological and societal consequences of internet gambling expansion that we have not considered in our legislative review of expansion that has incredible social context?
One of the most interesting aspects to your question, I think, is what is happening in the UK and in Australia, which are actually more advanced in terms of more gambling than here in the United States. And what it shows as far as internet sports gambling is concerned is really quite remarkable. Advertisements now on TV up to 1/5 to 1/3 of all advertisements on television in those two countries is now about internet and sports gambling, directed in many cases to kids. Kids begin to think, they don't look at sports the same way anymore. Sports isn't my team against your team, it's my sport. And it's not only betting on a game, it's within game betting. Is the next pitch going to be a ball or a strike? Is this guy going to score a goal before that other guy scores a goal? Constant, real-time betting. And kids are beginning to look at sports as, gee, it's all about betting. It's not about what sports used to be. That is already happening in the UK. There is study after study of it. If I would hope the committee would be interested in it and would ask for some of those studies, but they are of enormous concern, or they should be, to every parent and everyone who is concerned about kids.
And a final question, Mr. Chair, thank you for the indulgence, is your support of bill number 5167 is to encourage the legislature to commission a study. And with what we talked about earlier, the long drama of gambling expansion stalled out, if we were able to pass this and put it into effect and to implement and effectuate a study to give us some good data points, that would be a pathway that you would encourage for us as a state as we continually explore the various opportunities for revenue and expansion. Would you not think that would be a very useful tool for us as a state to give us some guidance? Even if we go into additional gambling expansion, at least we then now have a template and a roadmap to say, these are some of the indicators and some of the plans that we could put in place to protect the general public as we pursue this avenue. So would you not say that passage of 5167, absent of all the other bills we're discussing as it relates to gambling expansion, should be of a first priority for this committee and for this legislature before we do anything else about gambling expansion?
Absolutely. There's almost no point doing this study if we're just going to go ahead and expand gambling before anybody knows what the cost would be. I totally agree with that. Furthermore, this is the perfect time to do it. The state of Connecticut and the tribes are deadlocked. We all know that. That's what this discussion was about here all morning. This is the perfect time to do the study. Let's get the study done, and then we can see where we are in 6 months from now or 8 months from now or beginning of 2021. And then we'll have some solid information to make a decision on. Without that, I really don't know how you cast a vote on this subject.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And before we finish, I also want to compliment the chair of this committee for raising this issue and in concert with us as we explore gambling expansion in the state to also consider some of the societal consequences. And I want to make it public to compliment our chairs for their consideration on all shareholders that are impacted by these discussions. So thank you very much, Congressman Steele, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yep, thank you. Representative